Thank you, Jakob. Thank you very much. So, 75 years of this book, which is a classic in science, but also something of a paradox in the history of science. This little book was based, as Jakob said, on lectures that Schrödinger gave the year before the publication of this book at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Study. And in the introduction already, Schrödinger says that, well, he knows that a physicist crossing boundaries and entering another discipline is likely to make a fool of himself. But someone, he says, has to do it. And with this, he offers his apologies and goes on, obviously knowing that some criticism would attend publication of this book. And this criticism came. For instance, Linus Pauling, twice Nobel Prize winner, wrote that this book gives no contribution to biology, maybe even a negative contribution, and that the discussion of thermodynamics is superficial, should not be tolerated in a popular lecture. And Max Perus, also Nobel Prize winner, and the next Viennese also said, what is true in the book is not new, and what is new is false, or worse, it was already known to be false at the time. And Sidney Brenner, again a Nobel Prize winner, says that, speaks of Schrödinger's fundamental error. So this is quite some heavy criticism, and I trust that Peter Schuster is going to elaborate on this in the next lecture. But at the time of the appearance of the book, it was in general hailed as a very interesting and important book. There were many reviews, and for instance, the famous geneticist Haldane wrote a review in Nature where he wrote, well, at a time when most physicists are engaged in war work and have hard time to keep up with their own subject, Schrödinger in neutral Ireland has found leisure enough to turn to another branch of science, genetics. And he makes fun of the fact that Schrödinger says that genetics is easily the most interesting discipline of our days. And Haldane asks gently whether the posterity would confirm this opinion of Schrödinger. Well, and one can say that posterity did confirm Schrödinger's opinion. And in fact, to no small measure, thanks to this book, there was an enormous progress in genetics in the following years. And the whole cohort of brilliant scientists turned to molecular genetics, and the high points were, of course, the discovery of the double helix 10 years after publication of the book and the breaking of the genetic code. Jim Watson, for instance, said, from the moment I read Schrödinger's book, when he was 18 years old, I became polarized toward finding out the secret of the gene. And he writes that otherwise he would be, without this book, he would have remained an unknown ornithologist for the rest of his life. And he also writes that his colleague Crick was decisively influenced by the book, developing his interest in biology by reading this What is Life by noted theoretical physicist Erwin Schrödinger. And Crick himself, in his autobiography, What Math Pursued, he confirms this judgment. What is Life had an essential impact on his own life. And Maurice Wilkins, also a Nobel Prize winner, also instrumental in discovering the double helix, was also decisively influenced by What is Life. He turned from physics to molecular genetics because of this. Maurice Wilkins also wrote his memoirs, considered himself as a third man of the double helix, and confirms the importance of this book. The only one I'm not sure is the fourth person in this quartet, Rosalind Franklin, because she died tragically too early to leave her memoirs. And so with her, I cannot be sure. But certainly, for instance, Erwin Schrödinger, another Erwin and another Viennese immigrant, incidentally, who discovered the pairing rules, but not the base pairing itself. Erwin Schrödinger was decisively influenced by this book. And Seymour Benzer was essentially influenced. And same goes for François Jacob and for Jacques Monod. Dan Nicholson, from Konrad Lorenz Institute, only recently attracted my attention to this fact. And there were Gunther Stent, a former physicist or chemist who turned to molecular genetics and so on. So a whole generation was turned on by this book. And a few months only after the discovery of the double helix, Crick wrote a letter to postcard maybe, to Schrödinger, saying that Watson and I were discussing how we were entering this field, and we discovered that we had both been influenced by your little book. And we thought you might be interested in the enclosed reprints. You will see that it looks as though your term, aperiodic crystal, is going to be a very apt one. The DNA, the double helix that was discovered by Crick and Watson is not, of course, a crystal. It is a polymer, but it can be crystallized in the laboratory, and it looks like a rope ladder with rungs, and these rungs are of 4 possible types, and the arrangement of these rungs, which is aperiodic, of course, transmits the instructions to the organism on how to reproduce and how to develop. So it was indeed remarkably apt. But what is also remarkable is that Schrödinger never replied to this kind letter. I looked very intensively and I couldn't find any reply to this letter. And more importantly, he never returned to this field. He wrote in the following years, and more than 1 decade, he wrote on all possible things, and he corresponded a lot with many people. But he never mentioned, to my knowledge, at least not in writing, he never mentioned the tremendous progress in molecular genetics that his book had initiated. And this is really a paradox, and I want to try to understand a little bit this paradox, and maybe it helps if we run through a short biography of Schrödinger's life. I have to apologize. Many here know a lot more about this biography than I do, and I have to express my gratitude to the Zentralbibliothek for giving me the pictures that I will use. Schrödinger was born in Vienna in 1987, and he grew up in the house of his grandfather, Alexander Bauer, who was a professor of chemistry at what is now Technical University. The house was right next to the Kapuziner Gruft, incidentally, so right in the center of the town. And what is important maybe is that the father of Schrödinger was an entrepreneur, but with an academic background and always very interested, actively interested in botanics. And the mother came from England. Her family came from England. And so little Erwin grew up bilingual because his mother and his aunts, who really were doting on him, were always speaking English to him. Well, he didn't go to primary school, but he then went to the Akademische Gymnasium. This is not the school uniform of the Akademische Gymnasium, incidentally, but we see from this picture that he was a very good-looking young man, and he knew it. And he was a great ladies' man for all his life. After he was the best in the school in everything, in humanities and in science, in every field. And after his A-level, he started studying at the University of Vienna. And his aim was to study physics with the famous Professor Boltzmann. But Boltzmann that same year had committed suicide. Incidentally, that same year also the young Ludwig Wittgenstein wanted to study with Boltzmann. When he heard about the suicide, he moved and studied in Berlin. But Schrödinger remained in Vienna and studied with the theoretical physicist Hasenöhrl, who was a very good physicist, successor of Boltzmann. And the Physics Institute at the time was deeply inspired by the legacy of both Mach and Boltzmann, by these two titans. And in a very rough first approximation, one can say that Schrödinger took a lot of his physics from Boltzmann and a lot of his philosophy from Mach. But this is very rough, yes? In any case, he got his PhD with 23, with Professor Exner. He made his habilitation 4 years later. In between, he was einjährig Freiwilliger. He made his military service. Important is that in 1910, the Radium Institute was built, and a lot of very interesting physical work was going on at that time there. For instance, the research of Hess and de Hevesy both received Nobel Prizes in physics later. And in 1913, the physics building opened. Well, the career seemed in full swing when the war broke out, and Schrödinger was lieutenant on the Italian war front, like incidentally Wittgenstein too. And later, during 1917 or so, he was moved for military service, but farther away from the front to the Hohe Warte, where he was supposed to work and give lectures on meteorology. After the war, he had to think of after the war, there were miserable years in Vienna, and a lot of illness and hunger and so on. And in short succession, Schrödinger lost his father, his mother, and his grandfather. But on the positive side, he married Annemarie Bertel, and his marriage, which was a very open marriage, one must say, from both sides open, lasted for 40 years to the end of their life. And career-wise, well, in 1918, Schrödinger had received an appointment at the University of Czernowitz in spring 1918. But then it turned out that Czernowitz no longer belonged to Austria. And so he became a physicist first in Jena, and then in Stuttgart, and then in Breslau. And then in 1921, the crowning achievement, he became professor at the University of Zurich. This was already an extremely prestigious place, because Schrödinger there was the successor of Albert Einstein, of Peter Debye, and of Max von Laue. At that time, interestingly, when Schrödinger was almost 35 years old, at that time he had not made any really important breakthrough, but he had been extremely versatile, and the committee noted that he works in the fields of mechanics, optics, capillarity, electrical conductivity, magnetism, radioactivity, gravitation theory, acoustic, you name it. He had worked on this. They even didn't mention his most important work to that date, which was on color theory. But the committee also mentioned that he was prepared to lecture on biometry, which is the next closest thing at the time to population genetics. So already at that time, he must have had a strong interest in biology. In 1926, then came the breakthrough, the annum mirabilis, where in a short succession he published 6 seminal papers on quantum theory, and the Schrödinger equation dates from that time, and from then on he really ranked among the most important physicists of his time. And this was honored by his appointment to Berlin next year as the successor of Max Planck. And in Berlin, he was also a member of the Academy of Science, and for a few years he played an extremely important role, not only through his work, but also through making a lot of social networking between the scientists of that time. He organized Wiener Würstelabende, Viennese sausage evenings, in what he called the Hotel Psi Star, which was his house. And we can see that these were fairly entertaining events. Lise Meitner, who also worked in Berlin at the time, once was unable to come, and so she sent him a note where she said she could not come. How is it? Bei Schrödinger ist Würstelabend. Wer ging nicht gern hin, wo sicher frohe Stimmung herrscht und wo man trifft halb Wien? Halb Wien, incidentally, here, for instance, is Richard von Mises, a very important applied mathematician, and here is Hilde Geiringer, Viennese, who worked as assistant to von Mises and who would become a pioneer of population genetics. But at that time, yes, that time is interesting, by the way. This was 2 days before Hitler took power in Berlin, yes? At that time, Schrödinger was mostly more interested in genetics than she was. Schrödinger was extremely interested jointly with another theoretical physicist, namely young Max Delbrück. He was very interested in studying the quantum mechanics and the physical basis of life phenomenon. And this is, for instance, a letter exchanged between Schrödinger and Karl Sigmund, who was a professor of physics here, and whose brother, Hans Sigmund, was a director of the Vivarium, a very important research station in biology in Vienna. So at that time, Schrödinger was already working hard on genetics. Well, but when Hitler took power, Schrödinger, who was not persecuted, neither racially nor for political reasons, didn't want to have any of that, and he left the Third Reich and became fellow of the Model College. And there he got also the news of the Nobel Prize. And in that year, the Nobel Prize went to Dirac, to Schrödinger, and to Heisenberg. Here we see Dirac and Schrödinger arriving in Stockholm for the ceremony. And I must say they look as if they were going to assist to a funeral. But the picture is incomplete. Schrödinger was also there, and he certainly brought a lot of cheer to the event. Afterwards, in 1936, in what Schrödinger later said was a singularly ill-advised move, he returned to Austria. He became professor in Graz and also honorary professor in Vienna, where he had regularly lectures. Here we see him preparing to give a lecture in the Auditorium Maximum. He's getting ready for it. But this was from February 1938. So you can imagine what happened in the next months. Hitler caught up with him. And so Schrödinger had to go into exile another time in summer, and he had to flee via Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, England, to finally the safe haven of Ireland, to the Dublin Institute for Advanced Study that had been founded specifically for Schrödinger by the main political leader in Ireland at the time, Eamon de Valera, who happened in his younger years to have been professor of mathematics, and he had a really strong interest in promoting science. Schrödinger at the time was working in unified field theory, but he felt that when he was asked to give a statutory lecture, he didn't have to give regular lectures, but once a year he had to give a statutory lecture. He would not speak on this field theory, but rather on genetics, on his ideas in genetics. And that is how in 1943 he gave this series of 3 lectures in February every Friday, and these lectures were extremely well attended. It may have helped that the Prime Minister himself was always sitting in the first row. They were so well attended that they had to be repeated always on the following Monday. And of course, there had to be a book with this manuscript, and this book was originally intended to be published by an Irish publisher, but there were some hiccups, and so it came out in November 1944 with Cambridge University Press. So let me briefly say how the life of Schrödinger went on. After the war, he came not to Vienna, because this was too dangerous for him. Vienna was surrounded by Soviet troops, but to Alpbach. He regularly came every summer to Alpbach in his beloved Tyrolia, but after the Staatsvertrag in 1956, he finally came back to Vienna. For 2 years, he could still work as a professor of theoretical physics in the physics department here, and he had an apartment at the bottom of the Strudelhof stairs in the Pasteurgasse. And then the following years, he was professor emeritted, but he was already in very poor health. And finally, when he died in 1961, he was buried in his beloved village in Alpbach. But let's get back now to his book. The book is very short, only 90 pages or so. This was incidentally noted by Haldane, who said the only thing that he really regrets is that it was only 90 pages and not 860 pages. But I think it's part of the success of that book. And these are the chapters, and it starts out with the question, why are atoms so small? This was a favorite question, a gambit for Schrödinger. He often used this in his lectures. The question is, of course, ill-posed, small compared with what? With us. So the real question is, why are we so large? Or why are we consisting of so many atoms? And he says, well, we must consist of many atoms because small ensembles of atoms are subject to stochastic fluctuations, are irregular, and therefore the law-like processes in life, the complex regulation, could not really work. That's why organisms have to be rather large. And then he goes on to give a state-of-the-art report on the hereditary mechanism, on Mendel's theory, and on mutations. And then he comes to the main part of his lecture, which is chapter 4 and chapter 5, where he discusses Delbrück's, Max Delbrück's work. That Delbrück had worked on in Berlin. Delbrück had finally, Delbrück incidentally was a younger theoretical physicist working in the group of Lise Meitner as an in-house theoretician, so to speak. But his main interest was in applying quantum mechanics to physics. And he wrote together with a famous Timofejas Resovsky, a famous geneticist, and a less famous chemist, Zimmer, he wrote this paper where he used a theory of mutations called the Treffer theory to get some idea of how large a gene is. I should maybe say Schrödinger did not even try to explain what is life. He didn't lose time. I'm sorry. But he immediately zoomed in on the question, what is a gene? Yes? And there he said, well, we started first of all with how large is a gene. And according to this theory of Delbrück, a gene consists of order of magnitude 1,000 atoms or so. It's not quite right, but at least it gave one a handle to start with. And then, yes, this is the young Max Delbrück, who later, in 1936 or so, left Berlin, also not because he was persecuted, but because he simply could not bear breathing in Berlin, and he went to the United States and became extremely important in the leading a so-called phage group and in promoting genetics. He also got a Nobel Prize eventually. But this chapter 6 and 7 are based on the ideas of Ludwig Boltzmann and on Ludwig Boltzmann ideas of thermodynamics of the relation of entropy with order and with disorder. And the argument of Schrödinger is that what we know about the small size of the gene doesn't fit with the thermodynamics as we know it, which reigns throughout the physical world. Schrödinger says enough is known about the material structure of life to tell exactly why present-day physics cannot account for life. He says living matter, while not eluding the laws of physics, he's not a vitalist, yes, as established to date, is likely to involve other laws of physics, hitherto unknown. He was expecting other laws, and this became particularly clear in his epilogue on determinism and free will, which he added and on which Haldane remarked that this epilogue does not fit with the rest of what Schrödinger says. there were the vitalists and the mechanists. Yes, the vitalists thought there was a special force to living matter, and the mechanists said no. And Schrödinger said he's a mechanist, but Haldane said a mechanist must either give a mechanic account of life or turn a somersault. In his epilogue, Schrödinger does the latter with very great elegance. And Schrödinger must have been aware of his own inconsistency, because he quoted, if a man never contradicts himself, it must be because he has nothing to say. But in any case, the main impact of his message was we need other, so far unknown, laws of physics to explain how order could be preserved by heredity over many generations. And it turned out that this was not the case. Yes? Let me say that the book has essentially two messages. The first message of Schrödinger's book is that the gene is an aperiodic crystal, encoding the instructions for the cellular mechanism. And this was brilliantly confirmed by the discovery of the double helix. But the other message of Schrödinger is that the cell is something that feeds on negative entropy, that physical laws obtain order from disorder in the sense that, in the basic thermodynamic fluctuations, there is a lot of disorder. If the ensemble is large enough, this averages out and we get order. But the gene is not large enough, so we must have another way of getting order. And he said this is an order that comes from order transmitted through the generations. He is very vague on this, and actually Peter Schuster is going to say a lot, I'm sure, about this. But this second message was not nearly as successful. I mean, of course, there is a nice tradition of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. For instance, Leo Brillouin and Ilya Prigozhin got Nobel Prizes about this. But it remained a marginal field and had a much less impact on the development of biology and of molecular genetics. It is only recently that it has been found that, after all, this idea, that there are a lot of open and interesting problems on this. But let me just, because I'm sure I have to finish soon, let me just say that Schrödinger was by no means the only physicist who thought that there would be other laws that are needed to explain life. A very strong proponent was Niels Bohr, who in several papers and many lectures claimed that if one wants to apply physics to biology, one must use a hitherto unknown physical law, which he somehow compared with a complementarity principle in quantum mechanics. Very roughly speaking, that if an observer looks too closely at living matter, then this matter stops being alive, and so then there needs to be a complementary viewpoint on this. And Pascual Jordan, who was also one of the basic pioneers of quantum mechanics, and who together with Max Born and Heisenberg produced the matrix mechanic, which is mathematical equivalent to Schrödinger's wave mechanics. Pascual Jordan also wrote a lot about this need for new and hitherto unknown laws, like Erwin Schrödinger. They had very different ideas about what this law might be, but they all were looking for some mysterious physical law. And I imagine, finally, that when Schrödinger noted that the solution to the riddle, what is a gene, was not a new law, but simply an ingenious gadget. So the double helix, a very wonderful gadget, but based on the well-known laws, and in particular based on Schrödinger's equation itself. because it is based on chemical bonding, and chemical bonding can be explained by Schrödinger's equation. He was a bit disappointed. There was no new law needed at all. And this may be one of the reasons why for the rest of his life, he wrote on all possible things, on nature and the Greeks, and mind and matter, and on himself, and lots of topics. He never returned to the questions of molecular genetics, despite the fact that this molecular genetics was experiencing just at that time such a tremendous progress. Other physicists and chemists who were unwilling, who played an important role in the development of genetics, but were unwilling to accept the reductionist approach that they themselves were using so wonderfully well, were Max Delbrück and Günther Stent. They also always had the feeling that this was not enough, there was something extra, that was something missing. The whole thing reminds me of what Arthur Koestler, another Viennese emigrant incidentally, was writing in the Sleepwalkers when the Sleepwalkers, this was his biography of the scientists who really founded modern science, like Kepler and Copernicus and so on. He said it was as if while part of their spirit was asking for more light, another part had been crying out for more darkness. It happens quite often that scientists are looking out, or explorers are looking out for something quite different from what they are finding. Christoph Columbus is, of course, the foremost example. He was looking for a good way towards India and not at all to discover a new continent. But it happens much more often. Fermi, for instance, stumbled upon the fission of the uranium, but thought it was not splitting the uranium, but rather enlarging the uranium. He misinterpreted it. So often discoverers are misinterpreting what they are discovering. Let me finish by saying that in the 1940s, there were many brilliant theoretical ideas important for biology that were in the air. For instance, there was the approach by John von Neumann, who had devised some self-reproducing automata, with a plan for a self-reproducing automaton, where the machine constructs a copy of itself and then copies its own program and hands it up to the machine. This is something that Schrödinger had not yet understood, this division between the DNA and the proteins, as we would say now. At the same time, there was the information theory of Shannon, there was feedback theory, cybernetics of Norbert Wiener and others. There were many such brilliant ideas that proved later extremely important, but it was only one that really became the symbol for the revolution in molecular genetics, and that was the idea of the aperiodic crystal. And I think only Schrödinger could have pulled it off. Thank you very much.
Crick is cited for what he said about Schrödinger aperiodic crystal, and he says, and I have it here also the quotation, I have never understood what an aperiodic crystal should be. That man, Schrödinger, presumably had never heard about the polymer. That's original Crick. So Crick was, as you said, a kind of split personality, writing a very nice letter and giving nasty comments.
I think, well, it was Watson, he also has many nasty comments in his book about the double helix. So Crick also, they were both tough guys.
Well, he certainly thought that polymer would be a better expression. And the notion of polymer was already around for decades before. Yes, he could have used it. But nevertheless, I find it amazingly precise, because finally, the fact why the DNA structure could be solved was because it could be crystallized under laboratory conditions. And that crystallographers like Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin were essential in giving the clues to elaborate the structure.
May I say one word?
Right.
The reason that you can have crystal structures, you can determine them, is because the molecules themselves make a periodic pattern. But this aperiodic crystal is inside the molecule, the aperiodicity. And that was the great success of X-ray crystallography, that you could resolve the non-periodic part inside the molecule. The periodic part is necessary to get a signal.
Yeah, I'd like to mention one aspect which was a mystery for both Delbrück and Schrödinger, namely the question of consciousness or mind. You know, Delbrück in his later life was always wondering how mind came about. He accepted the whole theory of evolving the universe and also of life, but how did the mind come to matter? That was Delbrück's interest in his later years. And I think Schrödinger simply thought that consciousness can not be deduced from any law or any physics or anything. He thought consciousness just appears somehow.
Is that very strange, I must say, ideas about consciousness. But consciousness a priori is not linked with life. You do not associate every virus or every bacteria consciousness necessarily. Yes. Of course, we have a tendency, subconsciously maybe, to say that life must be animated. In fact, anima and animal is the same. So we think of life as being endowed with a soul, with a consciousness. Yeah? But this is not necessary. And the fact that Schrödinger suddenly, in the last epilogue, was introducing consciousness and talking about free will, was, in fact, besides the point, the working of the cell is independent.
Well, in that connection, I might add a remark, and maybe you have an opinion on that, in Walter Moore's biography, he says that the reason the book was not printed in Dublin was the epilogue.
Yes.
Because, so to say, the Catholic
That's right.
Dublin could not tolerate such a...
Right. Yes. There's a funny story, because Schrödinger was very good friends with an Irish priest called Brown, can it be? I'm not sure, but in case something. Yes. And this guy was helping him with editing the language. And he thanks this priest in the introduction. And the priest had, however, not seen the epilogue. And when he noticed that there was an epilogue in this manuscript, he got a bit furious, because this was certainly not an idea that the Catholic Church could underline. It was much, much closer to the ideas in the Upanishad, the Hinduism, and the Catholicism. And therefore, there was a little bit of passing misunderstanding, and the editor said, no, this is too hot a potato for me, I will not publish it in the Catholic island. And therefore, Schrödinger had to go to England and the Cambridge University Press. And it was all for the best, because they have, of course, completely different ways of distributing their books and a little provincial Irish publishing house.
I think that both ideas which you quoted from Schrödinger are essentially right. One, the periodic crystal, as we heard, it is a periodic sequence of molecules which carries the aperiodicity, and the other is the feeding on negative entropy. Well, it's a different, difficult theme, but it is similar to the problem of Maxwell's lemon. And therefore can see people can work out machines which diminish entropy in one system by increasing entropy at the outside. And the detective that is what life is doing. The light from the sun comes with rather low entropy, or rather it can be enhanced by spreading it all around. That is what life is doing. So this is also in principle life of course. The mechanisms are difficult, and Schrödinger didn't know it, but the principle is there.
Well, yes, I briefly mentioned non-equilibrium dynamics, which is a complex field. But I think even Schrödinger said in the time between giving his lecture and publishing the book, he was already criticized for this idea of negative entropy, and he wrote to some people who criticized that yes, he should rather have used the term of free energy, of enthalpy, rather than entropy, but he didn't use it because he found it was too complex for a lay audience. I cannot say whether this is correct or not, but in any case, this is a field that is extremely interesting to this day, but not resolved in the sense as what is an aperiodic crystal. What does it mean by aperiodic crystal as a result?
Yep, thanks, Karl. That was a really great talk. I wanted to ask you, actually, follows.
May I just quickly say that this is Daniel Nicholson from the Montag Institute, who is actually working, but I learned this too late, working on this book of his life. Yes,
I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts on the two parts of the argument in the book, right? So clearly, much of the book has to do with the stability of the gene, considerations of scale and size, as you mentioned in the first chapter, that leads him to conclude that the genetic material has to be understood as a crystal. And much of the rest of the book is actually, as you noted, like drawing on Delbrück's model to try to understand the structure of the gene. And then you have this chapter on thermodynamics, which you've already discussed, which seems to be drawing on a lecture from 1890 by Boltzmann, where he talked about entropy and life. But what I haven't been able to understand, and I was wondering what are your thoughts on this issue, is how do the two parts relate argumentatively? So on the one hand, there is order, which is order from order, right, which is the transmission of the genetic information from parent to offspring, and all the order that one finds in an organism is actually an amplification of the order in the genetic material. So that's one answer to the question of the nature of biological order. But then by talking about thermodynamics and suggesting that metabolism is necessary to understand the maintenance of order, it seems to be preempting the whole sort of non-equilibrium of thermodynamics order from this order research program that later developed by people like Grigg and others. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about how Schrödinger connects these two aspects of the story. How does the aperiodic crystal in any way sort of relate physiologically, functionally to the needs, the metabolic needs of the system to maintain itself rather than in a negentropic state?
Well, the brief answer is I don't know it. And I think the argument is full of holes. And the content of Schrödinger's book actually full of mistakes and errors. This is a paradox, that this book could have such a tremendous transcendental influence on the history of science, not by its content, not at all. Nobody would recommend a young student of genetics start by reading Schrödinger's book. Yes? But by its impact on a generation of scientists, by the enthusiasm that it raised just at the right time.
Just one quick question. Is it known why he went to Dublin instead of going back to Cambridge, which would be...
Well, it looks like, but he hated the British universities. He hated everything about England. He didn't like this high table atmosphere, this tradition which was based on medieval monasteries actually, and he was extremely annoyed by the fact that he was not, he had his wife, but he also had at the same time another wife, meaning another wife who had, he had 3 daughters incidentally, each one by a different woman, and known by his own wife. In any case, in Oxford, people made it clear that they considered this kind of living with women. Schrödinger found that none of the reasons he wanted to be rid of that. So he found much more freedom in classical countries like Ireland, Austria, where we know
I guess he didn't get along well with Lindemann, who was important.
Yes.
Oxford also. So, are there some further comments?
No, maybe I just want a second that this book is full of errors, but I think that's why it created such an interest, because people wanted to figure out the correct interpretations, the correct questions. And it was a time when a lot of stupid ideas came up and were again sort of disappeared afterwards.
Yeah, perhaps one can say it is full of mistakes, but glorious mistakes. Okay, and if there are no further questions, I think we can now go on to the 2 minutes about. We can start the next lecture.